A millionaire, right in the middle of closing a substantial multi-million-dollar agreement, was completely blindsided by a call from 911 emergency services. He was stunned to hear the dispatcher share that his young son was famished and pleading for a happy meal. The heavy, stale air of the 911 dispatch center was thick with the scent of burnt coffee from a well-worn automatic brewer. Emily gently massaged her temples, trying to soothe the persistent ache after 10 hours glued to her monitor. Tuesday afternoon shifts typically settled into a predictable lull, mostly filled with calls about felines stuck high up in trees or minor fender benders in the local supermarket's parking lot. Her fingers tapped softly on the keyboard, finishing up a report on a mistaken fire alarm downtown. Her mind was already drifting toward the welcoming comfort of her bed at home. Suddenly, the signal light for line number 12 began to flash a bright, insistent red. There was no blaring ring, just the silent, rapidly blinking light, quiet, yet demanding immediate attention. Emily sighed, adjusted her headset, and hit the connect button. She braced herself for the usual cacophony of panicked screams, wailing sirens, or the slurred, angry tirades of someone overly enjoying their evening, the familiar sounds of urban commotion she had managed for the past 8 years. 911. "What is the nature of your emergency?" Emily asked reflexively, her voice low, professional, and carefully detached. But the response she received was not chaos. A prolonged moment of quiet hung on the line. "Ma'am." A small, hesitant voice finally spoke up, as if the caller was trying hard not to be a bother. It was the voice of a very young child. Emily stopped typing immediately. Her body stiffened in her ergonomic chair. "Hello, ma'am." The voice continued, so polite it was heartbreaking. "I'm sorry, but I'm really hungry. Daddy told me to call this number if I needed help." Emily swallowed hard. All the weariness from her 10-hour shift instantly vanished. She glanced at the tracking map on her second monitor, the cursor still circling as it tried to lock onto the GPS signal. "Hello there, sweetheart." Emily lowered her voice to the gentlest tone she could manage, dropping her usual rigid professionalism. "My name is Emily. What is your name? Are you home all by yourself?" "I'm Noah," the boy replied, his voice followed by a long, deep sigh that sounded far older than his likely age. "I'm not alone. I'm with great-grandma, but the house is very big and it's cold. I'm hiding in the kitchen corner. Kitchen corner. Big house. Cold." Those keywords immediately put Emily's instincts on high alert. "Why are you hiding in the kitchen, Noah? Where is your great-grandma? She's sleeping." Noah answered, his voice calm, but holding a strange acceptance. "She's been asleep on the brown sofa in the living room since the morning show was on. Now the news is on and she still hasn't woken up." I shook her a lot. "Her hands are ice cold, like the cubes in the freezer, ma'am. She just won't move." A chill traced a path down Emily's spine. She didn't need to be a medical professional to understand what ice-cold hands and "won't move" meant for an elderly person who had been motionless for hours. This was no longer a call from a hungry child. This was a potential disaster unfolding in deadly silence. Emily's right hand flew across the keyboard, activating a code red, the highest priority danger situation, sending the signal to the nearest police station and emergency medical team in the suburban area the GPS was finally pinpointing. But she knew the most crucial task right now was keeping Noah calm. "Noah, you are doing such a good job." Emily said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "I bet great-grandma is just in a very deep sleep." "Have you had anything to eat since this morning?" "No, ma'am," Noah whispered. "I looked in the big fridge. It's taller than me, but there's nothing to eat inside, just lots of green bottles that belong to Daddy." I tried to open one, but it smelled very sharp and tasted yucky. Liquor. An empty refrigerator stocked only with expensive drinks. The image of a 4-year-old child standing on tiptoes before a massive opulent refrigerator, desperately searching for a bite of food among bottles of premium spirits, formed vividly in Emily's mind. "My tummy hurts so much, ma'am." Noah continued, his voice beginning to tremble, not from fear, but from profound loneliness. Can you bring me a Happy Meal? The one with the red emergency vehicle toy, please. I promise I'll be good. Emily bit her lip to hold back a deep sigh. Such a simple, heartbreakingly innocent request. The boy wasn't asking for his parents to return or for comfort. He was asking for a meal and a small trinket, the most basic necessities. All right, Noah, I promise, Emily said firmly. I'm going to ask some nice police officers to bring one right to you. But first you have to help me with something. Do you know where your mommy and daddy are? Daddy is working to earn money? Noah replied instantly, like reciting a well-rehearsed lesson. He's very busy. And Mommy Lara? Great-grandma said Mommy Lara went out this morning to buy Daddy a secret present. She said we were playing hide and seek, but she hid in her sleep for too long. The GPS signal finally locked onto the precise coordinates. A flashing red dot appeared in the middle of Hillsborough, an exclusive isolated villa community for the ultra-wealthy on the city's outskirts, where homes were guarded by towering fences and state-of-the-art security systems. Emily clicked the dot to pull up the homeowner's information. The profile appeared and the name on the screen made her gasp. Owner David Vance. David Vance. The finance titan frequently featured on the covers of glossy business magazines, sporting a confident smile and offering interviews about his philosophy of success. The man the entire city knew for his perfect family image, beautiful wife, wonderful child. Emily stared at the name, then heard the faint, painful rumbling of Noah's stomach echo through her headset. The brutal contrast made her feel physically ill. With a slightly trembling hand, she pressed the button to dispatch the urgent order to the Hillsborough County Police Department. The nice officers are coming now. Noah, Emily said, her voice catching slightly before she quickly regained her composure. You stay right there in the kitchen. Okay, don't go into the living room. They are going to bring your Happy Meal. Do you like French fries? Yes, ma'am. Noah replied, his voice much brighter. And I like a lot of ketchup, too. Emily watched the approaching status of the patrol unit pop up on her screen. She knew the doors of that dazzling mansion were about to open, and whatever was hidden behind that facade of wealth and perfection was about to be laid bare. A meticulously wrapped tragedy concealed in silk and luxury was about to shatter. Simultaneously, 30 miles east of the 911 center, a different world operated on the pulse of money and power, completely disconnected from Noah's hunger pangs. The boardroom on the 50th floor of the Vance Financial Tower was as cool and sterile as an iceberg in summer. The central air conditioning hummed quietly, maintaining the perfect temperature to keep even the most intense minds sharp. David Vance stood before a large projection screen, holding a gold-plated Mont Blanc pen, his sharp gaze sweeping across the tense faces of the executives seated below. This agreement isn't merely a merger, David stated, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the authority of a sovereign granting a favor. It is the acquisition of the future. You sign here and you are buying a first-class ticket on a ship where I am the captain. If you don't... He left the sentence hanging, a slight calculated smirk playing on his lips. The entire room held its breath. All eyes were fixed on David's pen tip, anticipating the historic moment when he would sign the $400 million document. Rang. The sharp, piercing sound of a phone violently shredded the solemn atmosphere. David's brow furrowed, his irritation palpable. He spun around to the corner of the room where his secretary Sarah was fumbling frantically with the desk phone. His number one rule: no interruptions, no exceptions. Sarah's face went pale. Her hand trembled as she picked up the receiver, and her color shifted from white to ashen gray within seconds. She put the phone down and hesitantly approached David, her steps faltering like someone walking to the guillotine. What did I say about interruptions during a board meeting? David growled, loud enough only for Sarah to hear, yet sharp enough to make her shrink. Sir, I apologize, Sarah whispered, her voice strained with fear. But it's the Hillsborough County Police Chief. He says it's an urgent situation, extremely urgent. Your son, Noah, Just called 911. David's hand froze in midair. What the police say the boy called reporting hunger. They suspect child neglect. A rapid response team is forcing entry into the house right now. Clink. The Mont Blanc pen slipped from David's grasp, hitting the reinforced glass table with a dry, jarring sound that echoed throughout the stunned room. Everything around David seemed to slow down. The millions of dollars projected on the screen suddenly became meaningless blurring before his eyes. Noah called 911, child neglect. Those words did not belong in his world. His world was control-perfect procedures, highly paid staff, and a compliant, beautiful second wife. David is something amiss. A business partner spoke up, breaking the suffocating silence. David lifted his head, meeting their scrutinizing gazes. He saw curiosity in their eyes and the first flicker of doubt beginning to take root. Seconds ago, he was a business deity. Now, he felt exposed and humiliated, like a failure stripped bare before a crowd. The meeting is concluded. David stated, his voice hoarse, stripped of all authority. He quickly snatched the documents from the table, stuffing them haphazardly into his leather briefcase, letting several important papers flutter to the floor without bothering to retrieve them. He bolted toward the door, leaving behind the hushed murmurs and stunned expressions of the financial world's most powerful figures. The hallway leading to his private elevator stretched out endlessly. David pulled his phone from his vest pocket while running his thumb, stabbing frantically at the touchscreen, searching for the name Laura. Laura. Where was Laura? The phone rang for a long time. Once, twice, 3 times. "Pick up the phone, damn it," David hissed. No one answered, only the endless, monotonous beeping of the voicemail machine. Rage flared up in David's chest, burning and consuming, eclipsing even his fear for his son's safety. Why wasn't she home? Why had he hired her? No, why had he married her to be a mother, a wife, a solid home front so he could conquer the world without worry? He had given her everything, the mansion, luxury cars, and unlimited credit cards. All she had to do was ensure Noah was fed and great-grandma took her medication on time. Yet now the police were breaking down his door. The police were taking his son away because he was hungry. "Lara, where in the world are you?" David roared into the phone before hanging up and throwing it violently into his briefcase. He thought of great-grandma, the dotty but proud old woman. This morning before he left for work, he had seen her watching television, and Lara was preparing breakfast. Everything had looked stable, a fabricated stability he had chosen to believe was real. His perfect family system had collapsed on the most critical day of his life, and the only person he could blame right now was the woman who should have been holding down the fort. The private elevator door opened. David stepped inside, jamming his finger onto the parking garage button. The metal doors closed, trapping him inside a sealed box, hurtling toward the earth at dizzying speed. David stared at the large mirror lining the elevator wall. The man in the reflection wore a rumpled suit, a crooked tie, and sweat plastered his hair to his forehead. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with helplessness and panic. This was not David Vance, the billionaire. This was a father who had just realized his catastrophic failure. Unable to contain himself any longer, David balled his fist and slammed it against the steel wall of the elevator. Crash. A searing pain shot through his knuckles, but it was nothing compared to the shame and anxiety tearing at his soul. The impact of David's fist on the elevator wall sent a ripple of vibration through the steel block, but 30 miles away, the real commotion was taking place under the tires of a police cruiser. Officer Miller slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a stop on the gravel driveway in front of the Vance estate. The smell of burnt rubber mixed with the damp, heavy air of Hillsborough's suburbs. "This is it," Miller announced into his radio, narrowing his eyes as he looked through the windshield. The mansion loomed large, a classical Victorian structure being consumed by creeping ivy and knee-high weeds obscuring the stone pathway. It looked more like a neglected mausoleum than the cherished home of a millionaire family. Miller and his young partner Davis jumped out, hands resting lightly on the sidearms holstered at their hips. They crossed the overgrown yard, the crunch of their boots on the gravel shattering the gloomy stillness. Reaching the massive, intricately carved oak front door, Miller tried the gold-plated handle. Unlocked. "Police, is anyone home?" Miller shouted simultaneously, pushing the heavy door open. The door swung wide, and the first thing that hit them wasn't luxury, but a smell. A distinct odor of stagnation, a mix of stale air mildew from the carpets and the sour stench of spoiled food. Miller wrinkled his nose and stepped inside. The interior was dim and disorganized. Weak light filtered through heavy velvet drapes illuminating dusty wooden floors. Expensive Lego blocks were scattered everywhere like a minefield, interspersed with empty pizza boxes piled high on a Louis XIV coffee table. A jarring contrast between opulence and neglect. "Good heavens," Davis whispered behind Miller. On the red velvet armchair in the living room, a small, frail, elderly woman lay slumped, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her messy gray hair partially obscured her wrinkled face. Miller approached, placing 2 fingers on her neck. Her pulse was faint, fluttering like a weak flame in the wind. On the side table, a bottle of prescription tranquilizers lay haphazardly, the cap wide open, a few white pills scattered across the glass surface. "Call EMS immediately." "She's breathing, but very faint signs of a potential overdose." Miller ordered, his voice sharp and urgent. Davis instantly yelled into his radio for backup. Moments later, the wail of the ambulance siren tore through the quiet air. The medical team stormed in like a whirlwind, the sharp beeping of heart monitors and hurried commands transforming the gloomy living room into a frantic emergency scene. Miller stepped back, giving the EMTs space to work. He put his hand to his earpiece where Emily's calm voice from 911 was still steadily reporting. "Miller, the boy said he's in the kitchen. To the right of the staircase, straight back." "Copy that," Miller replied succinctly. He navigated past the medical wires, cautiously moving toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. The vast kitchen appeared with its cold white marble countertops and immaculate stainless steel appliances, sparklingly clean and sterile, a stark opposite to the battlefield in the living room. Noah Miller called softly, trying to make his voice sound as unintimidating as possible. "I'm Officer Miller. I'm here to help you." There was no reply, only the gentle hum of the enormous refrigerator. Miller walked around the large kitchen island, and then he saw it. A pair of small, dirty, bare feet sticking out from the corner between the refrigerator and the wall. Miller approached, kneeling down on the frigid tile floor. Noah was huddled there, his knees drawn up, curled into the smallest possible ball. He tightly clutched an empty bottle of mineral water, the expensive glass kind served at high-end restaurants. His large, round eyes looked up at Miller, showing none of the typical fear of a child facing a stranger, only drawn-out anticipation. Miller noticed the boy's chapped, dry lips, and a wave of pure anger surged through his chest. He had been on the job for 20 years and had seen all manner of crimes, but the cruel neglect perpetuated by the wealthy always drove him mad. They had the money to purchase the world, but couldn't manage to buy their own child a meal on time. "Hello, Champ," Miller said, trying to steady his trembling voice. "Are you okay, buddy?" Noah blinked, holding the empty bottle toward Miller, his small hand shaking slightly. "Officer." The boy's voice was hoarse, full of hope. "Did you bring the Happy Meal? Emily said you would bring it." Miller's old heart tightened painfully. He swallowed the lump in his throat, feeling as though he'd been slapped hard on behalf of those irresponsible parents. "Yes, I did, I promise." Miller said, his voice cracking a little. "We're going to get it right now. But first I need to get you out of this cold house." He reached out and scooped Noah up. The boy was feather-light, his bony body pressing against Miller's uniform shoulder. Noah rested his head obediently on Miller's shoulder, dropping the empty water bottle to the floor with a sharp clatter. Miller held the child close, striding quickly out of the cold kitchen, walking past the living room where medics were inserting tubes for great-grandma. He didn't want Noah to see that scene for another second. Outside by the cruiser, he carefully strapped Noah into the back seat. Davis stood beside the car, his face pale after witnessing the scene inside. Miller picked up his radio, his hand clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He looked through the car window and saw Noah pressing his face against the glass, his eyes still fixed on the promise of food. The rising indignation transformed into the cold resolve of a law enforcement officer. "Dispatch, this is Miller," he said into the radio, his voice sharp and controlled. "Child located, condition neglect and severe dehydration. The grandmother is in critical condition due to possible overdose. I am issuing an immediate urgent bulletin for the legal guardian Lara Vance. I want her located and brought back here for questioning immediately." No sooner had Officer Miller's urgent bulletin been broadcast over the police radio waves than Lara found herself immersed in a completely different world 15 miles away. Washington Square Mall glowed under warm yellow light. Soft jazz music blended with the quiet chatter of leisurely shoppers. Lara stood before the glass counter at Brooks Brothers, her slender fingers lightly tracing the high-quality Italian silk fabrics. She paused at a navy blue tie with subtle, intricate patterns. This color would bring out the blue in David's eyes. He would wear it to his parents' anniversary party this weekend. She imagined his rare smile upon receiving the gift, a small moment of acknowledgement she had yearned for since she became a part of the Vance family as the second wife. "An excellent choice, ma'am," the young salesman said, giving her a perfectly practiced corporate smile. "This pattern just arrived this morning. Your husband will certainly appreciate it." Lara smiled back, her eyes shining with pride and relief. "Thank you, I'll take it. Please wrap it for me, the silver paper." He prefers simplicity. She handed her credit card to the clerk, her mind briefly drifting to Noah and great-grandma at home. The old woman had been quite spirited this morning, claiming she felt as strong as a youth and wanted to personally teach Noah to play chess. "Go on, you silly girl," she had said, gently pushing Lara toward the door. "Go get your husband a gift. Stop hovering in the kitchen, it's dull." Lara had trusted her. She wanted to trust her because she too needed a moment to breathe, to feel like she was more than just a high-class nanny in her own home. Her phone buzzed violently in her designer handbag, shattering her thoughts. Lara jumped quickly, rummaging for it. It must be David, she thought, her heart beating a little faster. Maybe he was finished with his meeting early and wanted to invite her to dinner. She answered without looking at the number, her voice filled with anticipation. "Hello, dear, I'm here." But it was not David's familiar, deep voice that answered. A strange, sharp and cold voice, like a judge's gavel slamming down, came through, freezing the smile on her lips. "Is this Lara Vance?" Lara stiffened, gripping the phone tightly. "Yes, it is. Who is calling? I'm Sergeant Carter, Hillsborough County Police. Where are you right now?" The question was not a pleasantry. It was a command. Lara felt her stomach clench. A cold premonition washed over her. I'm at the shopping center." Lara stammered, her voice starting to tremble. "Has something happened? Is my husband all right?" "It's not your husband." The officer's voice was icy, every word like a dagger aimed at her eardrums. "It's your son Noah and the elderly woman at your residence. We just received a 911 call from the boy. Currently, the elderly woman is in critical condition due to a potential drug incident, and the child was found severely famished and dehydrated." Lara felt the blood drain completely from her body. Critical condition, starved. The words spun wildly in her head, illogical and cruel. "That can't be," she whispered, her breath becoming shallow. She was fine this morning. "I left food out." "You be quiet and listen carefully." The officer cut her off, his voice devoid of patience. "We are issuing an order for you to report to the station immediately. You are currently being considered for detention on charges of neglect and endangerment. Get to the station right now, or we will come and put restraints on you right there in the middle of the mall." Click. The phone slipped from Lara's hand, though she managed to keep it hooked on the edge of her bag. However, the beautifully silver-wrapped gift box the clerk had just handed her wasn't so lucky. It dropped onto the polished tile floor with a dry thud, causing a few surrounding shoppers to turn their heads. "Ma'am, are you all right?" the salesman asked worriedly, stepping around the counter. Lara heard nothing. In her ears, there was only the buzzing sound of complete collapse. The perfect world she had tried so hard to build, the image of the devoted wife and stepmother she had meticulously cultivated, had just been crushed in a single phone call. She looked down at her shaking hands. Was she a person who committed serious offenses? Had she done something truly terrible? She had only gone to buy a tie. I have to go home," Lara mumbled, her face deathly white. She spun around, leaving the expensive gift box abandoned on the floor, and fled the store like a maniac. She ran desperately through the long hallways, pushing past people who were strolling leisurely. She bumped into a large man knocking the coffee out of his hand, but she didn't stop. "Hey, watch where you're going." The curse echoed behind her, but Lara didn't care. She pulled out her phone, running while frantically dialing David's number. Her fingers, slick with cold sweat, kept slipping on the touchscreen, forcing her to try 3 times before finally connecting. "Please, David, pick up. Please tell them I didn't mean it. Tell them great-grandma told me to go." The phone rang. Once, twice. She held her breath, waiting for his voice, her only anchor in this storm. But all that answered was the deadly silence, followed by the emotionless, consistent beep, beep, beep before transferring to voicemail. "David, where are you?" Lara screamed into the phone, tears beginning to flow, blurring her carefully applied makeup. "Why aren't you answering? I'm scared." "David." Her husband's silence was even more terrifying than the police accusation. It confirmed her biggest fear. She was being abandoned. She was completely isolated in this sudden storm. Lara ran down into the dark underground parking garage. The flickering fluorescent lights cast ghostly shadows on the concrete walls. She found her car, her hand shaking violently as she fumbled with the key fob before managing to unlock the door. She collapsed into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut, cutting herself off from the outside world. Her breathing was ragged, her chest tight as if someone was crushing her heart. She looked into the rearview mirror. The woman looking back was no longer the elegant, confident Lara Vance. It was a person in a state of utter panic, her eyes wide with terror. "I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong." Lara repeated the mantra, trying to convince herself, but the distant echoing sound of police sirens in her mind suggested otherwise. She started the car, the engine roaring in the empty garage. The vehicle shot forward, tires screeching against the concrete. Lara slammed the gas pedal, heading straight toward the house in Hillsborough. Tears blurred her vision, turning the streetlights into streaks of shimmering, distorted light. Lara's Mercedes tore like a missile down the oak-lined street leading into the estate community. The engine roared, tires squealing against the pavement, reflecting the chaos erupting in her chest. In the distance, the flashing blue and red lights of emergency vehicles pierced the descending darkness, turning her peaceful home into a dazzling and terrifying crime scene. David was already there. He stood motionless near the gate, like a stone statue carved amidst the human confusion. In front of him, medical personnel were rushing to load a gurney into the ambulance. Great-grandma lay still on it, her small face mostly obscured by a large oxygen mask, tubes snaking from her body to various urgent beeping machines. Another patrol car slowly rolled away. Through the window glass, David caught Noah's eye. The boy pressed his face against the window, his large eyes looking up at his father, innocent and confused. He didn't cry or call his name. He just stared as if observing a stranger through a glass tank. "I am a failure." He had a mountain of money, but his son looked at him as if he were nobody. Lara's car braked hard, stopping just behind the ambulance, nearly hitting the barricade. The car door flew open. Lara stumbled out. Her carefully styled blonde hair from the morning was now messy, plastered to her sweat-soaked forehead. She ran toward the gate, her high heels catching on a crack in the pavement, almost sending her sprawling, but she didn't stop. "David, David," Lara called out, her voice fractured by the wind. Hearing his name, David spun around. The moment his eyes met Lara's, all the pain, humiliation, and fear that had been building for the past hour exploded into uncontrollable fury. He didn't see his panicked wife. He saw the source of this entire collapse. David charged forward like a wounded, cornered animal. He shoved aside the yellow caution tape pushed past an officer who tried to block him and lunged straight toward Lara. "You," David bellowed, his voice echoing through the street, drowning out the static of police radios. He grabbed Lara by both shoulders, his fingers digging hard into her flesh, through the thin silk blouse, shaking her violently as if to wake her from a nightmare, or perhaps to transfer his own burden of guilt onto her. "What in God's name did you do, Lara? I trusted you with my son. I gave you everything. All you had to do was stay home and manage this family. Was that so difficult?" Lara was stunned, her body going limp under his rough grip. She opened her mouth, wanting to speak, to explain. "Grandma told me to go. I went to buy you a gift. I thought she was fine." Thousands of words clogged her throat, but facing David's burning eyes, no sound escaped. Only hot, salty tears spilled out. I didn't mean," Lara sobbed weakly. "Didn't mean what?" David cut her off, leaning in close, his breath ragged and laced with anger. "My mother's on that gurney. My son was taken away by the police because he was starving." "What are you going to explain? That you were too busy shopping, too busy spending my money while my son was left to starve at home?" Around them, curious neighbors had gathered outside the police tape. The housewives, who usually exchanged superficial pleasantries with Lara at afternoon tea parties, were now whispering intently, their eyes filled with scrutiny and contempt. "See, I told you so," a neighbor muttered loud enough for Lara to hear. A stepmother can never truly care for another woman's child. She probably wished the old woman would pass on so she could be free. "Poor little boy," another clucked. "She looks so sweet, but her heart must be wicked, starving a child that's truly evil." Those words were like needles piercing Lara's skin, hurting more than David's grip. She looked around, searching for a single sympathetic eye, but found only cold judgment. In their eyes, she had already been convicted as an evil figure from a fairy tale, the destroyer of a reputable family's happiness. "Hey, let her go." Officer Miller and his partner rushed in, separating David from Lara. Miller pushed hard against David's chest, forcing him to step back. "Mr. Vance, calm yourself now. If you continue to assault her or disturb the scene, I will restrain you." Miller warned, his hand hovering over his baton. David panted heavily, his chest heaving. He glared at Miller, then turned to look at Lara one last time. The look was no longer explosive anger. It was something far worse, profound disappointment and utter contempt. Lara stood exposed in the police perimeter, her hands clutching her shoulders where David's fingers had left red marks. She looked at him, a desperate plea in her eyes. "David, please, hear me out. Protect me." But David turned his back. He straightened his rumpled suit jacket, brushed his hands as if shaking off dirt, and shook off her entirely. His silence at that moment was the death sentence for their marriage. "Take them to the station," Miller ordered his subordinate, his voice weary but decisive. "Separate them. I don't want another scene in the cars. Ms. Vance in car number 2, Mr. Vance in car number 4. A young officer approached Lara, placing a hand gently on her back, guiding her toward a waiting patrol car. "Please step into the car, ma'am." Lara walked like a zombie. She ducked her head and climbed into the cramped back seat, the cold scent of plastic and stale cigarette smoke stinging her nostrils. The car door slammed shut with a dry thud, trapping her in the confined space, separating her completely from the free world outside. Through the tinted window, Lara saw David being led to a different patrol car a few feet away. He sat in the back seat, staring straight ahead, his face frozen and emotionless. He never looked back at her, not even once. No anxious glance, no trace of regret. The car carrying Lara began to move, pulling away from the familiar road leading to their home. She turned back to watch the luxurious mansion slowly disappear now, just a silent, empty block of stone. The police lights still flashed, illuminating the invisible shards of a family once considered perfect, now scattered and broken across the lawn. Laura leaned her head against the cold glass, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. The patrol car stopped outside the Hillsborough County Police Station gate. Laura was led inside through long, dimly lit hallways, smelling strongly of bleach and cheap coffee. They took her to room 4, a typical interrogation room she had only seen in movies. 4 walls painted peeling gray, a metal table bolted firmly to the floor, and a glaring white neon light hanging low from the ceiling, casting a cruel illumination that hid no flaws. A large mirror covered one wall, reflecting the image of a gaunt woman huddled on a chair, her hands clasped tightly to stop the trembling spreading through her body. The steel door opened with a screech. A detective walked in. He was a large, bald man with the tired, wrinkled face of someone who had witnessed too much of society's dark side. He offered no greeting, no name, only slammed a thick file down on the table with a loud thump, then pulled up a chair across from Laura, his eyes sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "All right, Ms. Vance," he began, his voice deep and intimidating. "Let's talk frankly. No circling the issue, no crocodile tears. How do you explain abandoning a 4-year-old child and a frail 80-year-old woman to go shopping?" Laura flinched, lifting her red-rimmed eyes to look at him. I didn't abandon them. Great-grandma said she felt fine. She was very alert this morning. She even wanted to play chess with Noah. She told me to go buy David a gift, and you believed her instantly." The detective raised an eyebrow, his tone openly derisive. "You believed an elderly person on high doses of tranquilizers. Did you not check her medication? Did you not think she might be confused? Or did you just need a convenient excuse to get rid of that burden?" "No, that's not true." Laura shook her head frantically, tears welling up again. "I love Noah. I take care of the grandmother every day. I'm the only one who remembers her medication schedule. I just thought she wanted some private time with her great-grandson." "Private time?" He sneered, leaning closer to her face. "The private time you speak of turned into a deadly trap. Did you know that the elderly woman is in the emergency room life, hanging by a thread? And the boy was so famished he had to call 911 asking for food. Do you think a judge will believe your grandma told me to go story? Or will they see a young, beautiful, uncaring stepmother only concerned with her appearance while neglecting her stepchild?" The accusations struck at Laura's deepest fear. The fear of being seen as an outsider, a parasite, the wicked stepmother. The harder she tried to explain, the more muddled and illogical her words became. I prepared lunch. I left it on the table." Laura stammered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know Noah wouldn't find it. I'm sorry. I truly am sorry." Behind the one-way mirror, David sat motionless in a swivel leather chair, his hands clasped tightly, his knuckles white. He stared at his crumbling wife in the next room, listening to her every sob through the wall-mounted speaker. Laura's weeping felt like needles pricking his conscience, but the cold, cruel logic of a businessman screamed a different message. Sitting beside him was the family's personal attorney, Mr. Harrison. A man with a face as hard and expressionless as money, he calmly flipped through the legal documents with chilling composure. "David, listen to me," Harrison whispered in his ear, his voice smooth but laced with poison. "The situation is highly unfavorable. The media is about to catch wind of this. Vance Financial stock will plummet tomorrow morning if the news breaks that you are a negligent father." David gritted his teeth, his eyes still fixed on Laura. "So what do you want me to do? Abandon her?" "We need to contain the damage," Harrison continued coolly. "She was the direct caregiver at the time. She was the one who left. If we redirect the negligence toward her, frame it as Laura's individual mistake, not a failure of your family system, then you save your custody of Noah and your reputation. You are the victim, David, a busy husband deceived by his wife regarding the care of the family. That's the story the public will accept." David shuddered, shifting all the blame onto Laura, making her a scapegoat to save his career and his ego. He saw Laura slumping forward onto the table, her shoulders shaking violently with fear. She had never asked anything of him but a little time. She had tried her best to salvage this fragmented family, and now he was planning to stab her in the back. But then the image of Noah looking at him through the police car window returned, the distant, accusing eyes. If he lost custody of his son, if he lost everything. David gripped the armrests of the chair, his fingernails digging deep into the leather upholstery. His internal struggle reached a fever pitch. He couldn't bring himself to step forward, but he couldn't sit still either. Just then, the observation room door quietly opened with a slight decisive click. David turned his head. A strange woman was standing in the doorway. She wore a simple knit jacket, her hair tied back messily, her face showing fatigue, but her eyes shone with fierce conviction. In her hand, she held a stack of crudely drawn crayon pictures and a half-drunk carton of strawberry milk. It was Emily. She said nothing, simply locking eyes with David. Her gaze held no fear of his power or wealth, only the proud challenge of someone who possessed the truth. She walked into the room, closing the door behind her, bringing with her a fresh wave of air about to blow away the cold, calculated chessboard Harrison had just set up. "I think you gentlemen are questioning the wrong person," Emily said, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of 1,000 pounds. She placed the drawing on the table directly in front of David. "And I have the evidence." Emily shot David a look sharp enough to freeze the stuffy observation room, then turned and headed straight for the door without waiting for permission. She knew she had just started a fight, but now wasn't the time to explain herself to men in suits. She had more important business at the end of the hall. The police station's children's waiting room was a clumsy attempt to disguise the harshness of the law. The pale yellow walls were covered with peeling Mickey and Donald Duck stickers, and the multicolored foam matting still radiated the coldness of the concrete below. Noah sat lost amidst a pile of rigid plastic toys, his head tucked into a cushion, twisting the hem of his t-shirt until it was wrinkled. He looked like a tiny period mark forgotten on a giant page full of grown-up rules. "Hello, champ," Emily said, gently entering the room and sitting down on the foam mat, disregarding the potential mess on her jeans. Noah lifted his head. His large, watery eyes blinked up at her. He recognized the voice. "You're the telephone lady, right?" Noah asked in a tiny voice. "That's right, I'm Emily." She smiled, pulling a carton of strawberry milk and a packet of chocolate chip cookies she'd bought from the vending machine out of her jacket pocket. "I brought you a little something. Not a happy meal. Sorry, the police officer said we have to wait a little longer. But this is yummy too." Noah's eyes lit up. He took the milk carton with both hands, jammed the straw in with a pop, and took a long, deep gulp, his cheeks puffing out like a chipmunk's. The raging hunger seemed to soothe his initial fear. "Is it good?" Emily asked, tearing open the cookie packet for him. Noah nodded eagerly, his mouth full of cookie crumbs. "It's yummy. I don't get to eat this at home. Daddy says it has too much sugar and causes tooth decay." "Well, Daddy is right, but today is an exception." Emily winked. "Noah, who is your favorite superhero, Spider-Man or Batman Spider-Man?" Noah replied instantly, pointing to a sticker on the wall. "Because he's a great wall climber." "Oh, really? Do you play Spider-Man often at home?" "Yes, ma'am, but our house is too big and the ceilings are so high. I mostly just play hide and seek with great-grandma." Emily nodded gently, steering the conversation toward the critical point as naturally as possible. Hide and seek is fun. Were you playing that game this morning too?" When Mommy Lara left, Noah stopped chewing, gulping down the cookie piece. He looked at Emily, his eyes clear and innocent. "Yes, ma'am." "Great-grandma said she was as strong as an elephant." Noah giggled, mimicking his grandmother's voice. She said, "Lara, go on, stop nagging me. I want to play with my great-grandson. You go buy a nice tie for his father. It's going to be a secret between the three of us." Emily felt her heart sink. Did Mommy Lara leave right away? "No, ma'am." Noah shook his head vigorously. Mommy Lara asked her 3 times. She stood by the door and kept saying, "Grandma, are you sure? Should I wait until Noah finishes eating?" But great-grandma pushed her outside. She even locked the bolt with a click and told me, There now, it's just the two of us, we can do whatever we want." And then what happened? Emily pressed, trying to keep her voice steady. Then she went and got the bottle of white candy Noah signaled with his hand. She took 2 pills. She said it was vitamins to give her strength to race me. Then she sat on the couch to rest for a bit. And then she just went to sleep. The boy's voice trailed off. I called her to wake up and play, but she wouldn't. Her hands were ice cold. I was scared she was mad because I was too loud, so I hid in the kitchen. I waited for Daddy to come home. Emily was stunned. The entire picture was laid bare, cruel and heartbreaking. There was no malice here. Only an elderly woman desperately clinging to her last bit of usefulness, a stepmother who was overly compliant and afraid of upsetting the elderly, and a child trapped between those disastrous expectations. The supposed neglect was actually an accident caused by a lack of emotional connection and foolish pride. She reached for the blank paper and box of crayons on the toy shelf, placing them in front of Noah. "Noah, are you a good artist? Can you draw me a picture of Mommy Lara standing at the door, waving goodbye?" Noah grabbed a blue crayon and busily scribbled on the paper. The childish, wobbly lines gradually formed a picture. A long-haired woman standing in a doorway, her hand raised in a wave. An old woman lying on a brown couch. And a tiny dot in the middle of the room, Noah himself. Most importantly, on the face of the long-haired woman, Noah drew a small downward curve. "Why is Mommy Lara sad?" Emily pointed to the drawing. "Because she didn't want to go," Noah said firmly. "But Great-Grandma told her to go, so she had to. Mommy Lara is scared of Great-Grandma." Emily picked up the drawing, feeling the weight of the truth contained in those innocent crayon marks. This was the most perfect, honest alibi no lawyer could ever dismiss. Lara hadn't abandoned her son. She had been pushed out by the very hierarchical system of that household. Emily stood up abruptly. She clutched the drawing tightly, carrying the half-empty strawberry milk carton with her. She looked at the boy one last time, her eyes filled with determination. "You stay here and be good, finish your cookies," Emily said. "I'm going to talk to your dad for a minute. I'll make sure he buys you that Happy Meal right away." She hurried out of the waiting room, her footsteps echoing sharply and purposefully down the hall. She wasn't a police officer nor a lawyer, but she was the only person who understood the language of truth right now, and she would not let that truth be buried in the cold room of calculation. Emily headed straight for the observation room where David and his lawyer were preparing to ruin an innocent woman's life. That door was about to be kicked open, both literally and figuratively. The observation room door swung open with such force that the hinges groaned, slamming against the wall with a bang that made both David and his lawyer Harrison jump and spin around. Emily walked in like a hurricane, no knock, no permission, completely ignoring the authorized personnel only sign plastered prominently on the window. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Harrison jumped to his feet, adjusting his tie with the reflexive defensiveness of a lawyer. "This is a restricted area." "I'm calling security." Emily completely ignored him. She walked straight to the polished mahogany desk where David was sitting and slammed the crudely drawn paper down right in front of him. "Look at this," Emily said, her voice not loud but carrying the full weight of the truth. "Look closely at what your son actually saw, not what your lawyer wants you to see." David looked down. On the crumpled A4 paper were the wobbly blue and red crayon lines of a child. A long-haired woman stood in a doorway, her hand raised high. Noah drew that Emily continued, pointing at the woman's shape. He said, "This is Mommy Lara waving goodbye, not running away, not sneaking off. She's waving. And look, her face is sad." Noah said Mommy Lara didn't want to go, but Great-Grandma pushed her out and locked the door behind her. David stared at the drawing. The innocent lines of his son's artwork were like a sharp blade slicing through the curtain of prejudice he had built around himself. "Mommy Lara is sad," That small detail seen through the eyes of a 4-year-old told a completely different story than the cruel scenario Harrison had just outlined. She was coerced, Emily said, her voice softening but still firm. The grandmother wanted to prove she was still capable. Lara is just a casualty of foolish obedience within that household dynamic. And now you're planning to turn her into a felon just to preserve your false sense of honor. David felt a lump in his throat. He looked up at Emily, then turned to Harrison. The lawyer was opening his mouth to object to something about the legal admissibility of a child's testimony. But before he could utter a word, the desk phone of the police chief seated in the corner rang. The chief picked up, listened for a few seconds, then frowned and put the call on speakerphone. Hospital on the line. Mrs. Vance is awake, everyone quiet. The whole room held its breath. The static of the phone speaker crackled, followed by the faint halting voice of an elderly woman who had just returned from the brink. Don't blame that girl, Lara." Great-grandma's voice was shaky, mixed with the sound of the oxygen machine. "It was me. I made her go. I told her to buy a gift for David. I wanted to look after my great-grandson myself. I thought I was still strong like I used to be." David gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "I took the wrong pills." Great-grandma coughed a few times, a sound that tore through the air. "I meant to take my joint supplements. My eyes are so bad I mixed them up with the sleeping pills. It's this old woman's fault. Don't hold that girl responsible." The grandmother's confession echoed in the silent room like a bucket of ice water thrown directly onto the calculating men. There was no conspiracy, no malicious neglect, just a tragic accident of old age and a terrible misunderstanding. Harrison hastily gathered the notes, outlining the blame, the stepmother strategy, stuffing them into his briefcase, his usual cold demeanor replaced by clear discomfort. He glanced at David, awaiting new instructions, but David was far beyond caring about legal strategy. He turned to look through the one-way mirror. In the cold interrogation room next door, Lara still had her head buried in her arms on the table. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. She sat there alone and desperate, enduring every humiliation, every cruel accusation, without once complaining about him or the grandmother. She had protected the peace of this fractured family until the very last minute, even as it was crushing her. A wave of self-loathing washed over David, not disgust for Lara, but disgust for himself. He remembered the desperate look in her eyes at the gate when he had lunged at her and shook her. He recalled the times she had timidly suggested hiring a private nurse for the grandmother, and he had haughtily dismissed it with the excuse that Vance family members take care of their own. It was him. His arrogance and callousness had put his wife in this room, and he had almost let her drown just to keep his own suit jacket spotless. "David, we need to reconsider the strategy." Harrison began lowering his voice. "Shut up," David roared violently, pushing the lawyer's arm away. He stood up abruptly, the swivel chair slamming against the wall behind him. He didn't look at Emily, the police chief, or Harrison. All he saw was the door leading to the room next door. David stormed out of the observation room, his footsteps pounding down the hall, as if racing against his own conscience. He ran to the interrogation room door, not bothering with procedure or permission. Crash. He shoved the heavy steel door open. It slammed into the wall with a terrifying sound. The detective, holding a pen and taking notes, jumped, dropping his pen to the floor. Lara looked up, her swollen eyes wide with terror, fearing that the final sentence had arrived. But David didn't come to pass judgment. He came to confess. The steel door was still vibrating from David's forceful entry. He stood there, his breathing heavy, his chest heaving beneath his white dress shirt, which was now rumpled with a popped collar button. The cold neon light of the interrogation room shone down, illuminating every bead of sweat on his temples. But this time, the arrogance of the finance mogul was gone. All that remained was a man laid bare by regret. Lara was hunched in her seat. She shrank back, her head bowed low, her swollen eyes tightly shut as she awaited a verbal blow, or worse, divorce papers tossed onto the table. She had braced herself for the worst-case scenario. David would call her foolish. David would tell her to disappear from his life. That was the script she had rehearsed hundreds of times in her head over the last hour. But there was no shouting, only the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, and they stopped right beside her chair. Lara peeked open her eyes. She saw David's expensive leather shoes, and then to her utter astonishment the shoes moved, his knees lowered, hitting the cold tile floor. David Vance, the man who never bowed to anyone, who always looked down on the world from the 50th floor of skyscrapers, was kneeling at her feet. "Lara." David's voice emerged hoarse and broken like glass being crushed. He reached out, grasping her cold, trembling hands. His hands were warm, tightly squeezing her fingers, transferring a warmth she thought she had lost forever. "I'm so sorry," David said, bowing his head so low his forehead touched her hands. "I was wrong. God, I was completely wrong." Lara was stunned. She looked down at the top of her husband's head, his usually well-combed dark hair now messy. She had never seen him like this. Never. What did you say?" Lara whispered, her voice faint, unable to believe her ears. "But I left. I let great-grandma." No, David looked up, staring directly into her eyes. His eyes were bloodshot, glistening with tears. "You did nothing wrong. It was me. I turned you into a high-class caretaker in this house instead of my wife. I threw money at you and told you to handle everything. Then I left to pursue my so-called great career. I left you alone to cope with it all. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I didn't protect you." Hot tears streamed from Lara's eyes, but this time not from fear. They were tears of relief, of liberation. She pulled one hand free and tremblingly touched David's cheek, feeling the rough stubble of his chin. "I thought you hated me," she sobbed. "I thought you were going to send me away. I will never do that again." David kissed her palm, a clumsy but the most sincere kiss he had ever given. "We're going to start over. Together. No more hired help, no more nurses, no more endless business trips. Just us." In the corner of the room, the elderly detective quietly closed the thick file. He removed his glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, and signaled to the younger colleague by the control board. "Turn off the recorder," he said quietly. "Turn off the camera too. There's no crime to investigate here anymore." The door opened again. The police chief walked in, followed by Emily. He held a thin official report, his demeanor no longer intimidating. "Mr. Vance." Mrs. Vance, the chief, stated his voice level, based on the latest statement from the hospital regarding the grandmother, and, well, the specific testimony from witness Noah provided by Mrs. Emily. Here we have decided to close the criminal investigation file. Lara let out a long, shaky breath, feeling as if a massive weight had been lifted from her chest. David stood up, but his hand remained firmly gripping hers. "Thank you, Chief," David said, his voice regaining some calm, though still shaky. However, the chief continued, his eyes meeting David's sternly. "This incident will be classified as a family incident. This means you will be under supervision by social services for the next 6 months, and the entire family is required to attend counseling sessions, no exceptions. Do you understand?" "I understand," David nodded firmly. "We will do whatever is required. I commit to that." "Good," the chief nodded, then turned to the detective. "Release them. File closed." David turned to Lara, helping her to stand. Her legs were still trembling from exhaustion, but David's arm around her waist was steadier than ever. He guided her out of the suffocating interrogation room, which had nearly become the grave of their marriage. They stepped into the bustling main lobby of the police station. The lights here were bright and much warmer than in the interrogation room. In the corner of the lobby, on the colorful foam matting, Noah was happily building a tower with plastic Lego blocks alongside Emily. As soon as he saw his parents emerge, Noah let out a shout of joy, dropping the plastic brick in his hand. "Daddy, Mommy, Lara." The boy launched himself like a tiny rocket, arms wide open. David let go of Lara, slightly dropping to one knee to meet his son. Noah barreled into his arms, his small hands wrapping tightly around his father's neck, then extending to clutch Mommy Lara's leg standing nearby. "I missed you both so much," Noah said, rubbing his messy face against David's expensive suit shoulder. It's boring here. No one wants to play hide and seek. David picked Noah up, kissing the boy's soft hair, inhaling the familiar scent of milk and childhood that he had ignored for so long. He pulled Lara close, wrapping his other arm around her shoulder, forming a closed circle sheltering the two most important women in his life amidst the loud government building. "I'm sorry, son," David whispered into Noah's ear. "I promise I will play hide and seek with you every day from now on. I won't make you wait anymore." Lara leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, her hand stroking Noah's back. Her tears fell again, but this time she was smiling. A few steps away, Emily stood leaning against the wall, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets. She watched the small family reunion, a subtle, relieved smile on her face. She didn't need thanks nor commendation. This moment was the biggest reward for her long shift. The job of a 911 dispatcher wasn't just taking calls. It was about connecting the broken pieces before they vanished forever. David looked up, meeting Emily's gaze. He gave her a slight nod, a deep acknowledgement that conveyed 1,000 words of gratitude. Emily nodded back, then turned and walked toward the dispatch desk to sign off her shift handover. "Let's go, my dear," David said to Lara gently. "We're going home." "No, wait. We're going to eat first." "Eat?" Noah looked up, his eyes sparkling. "Are we getting a Happy Meal, Daddy?" "That's right," David laughed, the most genuine, radiant laugh Lara had heard from him in their 3 years of marriage. "Happy Meal. I promised." The automatic glass doors of the police station slid open. The night air rushed in, bringing the chill of the dew, but also the feeling of freedom and a fresh start. The three of them stepped out of the building, leaving behind the glaring neon lights and the cold, unforgiving legal documents. The sleek black Mercedes glided smoothly down the empty boulevard in the dead of night. The yellow streetlights cast long, dancing streaks of light across the faces of the three occupants. No one spoke, but this silence no longer carried the oppressive weight of the police station. It was the quietude of peace, the calm after the storm. David had loosened his tie, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his strong arm resting comfortably on the steering wheel instead of clutching it until his knuckles were white. Lara sat in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, her eyes closed, a faint relieved smile playing on her lips. In the back, Noah was gazing out at the night streets, his legs swinging in his own rhythm. A strange sound echoed through the quiet atmosphere. It was loud and clear, impossible to ignore. Noah jumped, clutching his stomach, then giggled sheepishly. "My tummy is talking too loud, Daddy. It says it wants to eat right now." David burst out laughing, a hearty, natural sound that surprised even himself. He glanced into the rearview mirror, seeing his son grinning back at him. "All right, big guy," David said, signaling to the right lane. "Your tummy is right. We can't let that empty stomach go to bed." Up ahead, the giant yellow M sign of McDonald's glowed brightly in the darkness, beckoning like a lighthouse to hungry souls. David had never in his 20-year career imagined he would set foot in a place like this. To him, dinner meant Michelin-starred restaurants, aged wine and food plated like works of art. But tonight, the cheap yellow light of the fast food restaurant felt warmer than any crystal chandelier he had ever seen. The luxury car pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. The three of them got out. David held Noah's hand on the left and wrapped his right arm around Lara's shoulder. They pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell of frying grease and industrial floor cleaner hit their nostrils, but strangely it felt wonderfully familiar. The restaurant was deserted, with only one employee mopping the floor in a far corner. David awkwardly stood before the self-order touchscreen. He frowned his finger, hesitating over the myriad of confusing combo options. This one, Daddy Noah stood on his tiptoes, pointing to the image of the red box with a handle. "Happy Meal." "I want the one with the fire truck." All right, David mumbled, selecting the item. "And 2 large Cokes, more French fries, right?" They chose a plastic booth in a quiet corner by the window. David placed the tray down. 1 Happy Meal for Noah and a large pile of French fries for the adults. Noah cheered excitedly, grabbing the red box. He ignored the burger for a moment, reaching into the bottom of the box and pulling out a small, bright red plastic fire truck. "Look," Mommy Lara Noah held up the toy. A fire truck just like Officer Miller's car. Lara smiled, reaching for a napkin to wipe a smear of dirt from Noah's cheek. "That's wonderful, son. But now eat your burger or your tummy will complain again." David sat across from them, watching the mother and son. He picked up the grease-wrapped burger, awkwardly peeling back the paper. Before he would have scowled if a drop of oil stained his Italian dress shirt. But now he took a big bite of the burger, tasting the processed beef and cheap mayonnaise, and found it strangely delicious. Delicious because he was sharing it with his family. "Lara," he called softly. Lara looked up halfway through, dipping a French fry in ketchup. David said nothing, simply reaching under the table to find her hand. He squeezed it tightly. A handshake that substituted for 1,000 apologies, 1,000 promises. That he would change. That he would stay. Lara squeezed his hand back, her eyes glistening under the fluorescent light. She understood. David glanced at the watch on his wrist. 2:00 a.m. The $400 million merger signing had passed hours ago. The partners had undoubtedly left, and the company's stock would likely see some turbulence in the morning. But looking at Noah's ketchup-smeared smile as he zoomed the plastic truck across the table, David felt a profound sense of peace. He had just signed a different, infinitely more important contract. The contract of a father, the contract of a husband. And this contract had no end date. A week later. The 911 emergency center was as loud and busy as ever. Emily walked in for her morning shift holding a hot cup of coffee. She went to her familiar station desk number 12 and pulled up her chair. A small white envelope lay neatly on her computer keyboard. It had no postage stamp, only the inscription, "To Emily, Desk 12," written in careful script. Emily set down her coffee, curious, and opened the envelope. Inside was a sheet of A4 paper folded into quarters. She unfolded it and couldn't hold back a bright smile. It was a crayon, drawing the lines wobbly but full of bright, vivid color. 3 stick figures were holding hands. A tall man in a blue suit, a blonde woman in a pink dress, and a tiny boy in the middle. They stood next to a car with flashing lights on top, presumably a police cruiser, and next to that was a huge red square shape with a yellow M, a gigantic Happy Meal box. In the corner of the drawing, a neat adult handwritten note in soft black ink. "Thank you for listening when we forgot how to listen to each other." Noah finished his Happy Meal, and Daddy promised many more, but Mommy says he has to eat vegetables first. "Thank you, Emily." Emily gently ran her finger over the drawing, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She took a piece of tape and carefully affixed the drawing to the felt divider in front of her, right next to the list of emergency codes. It sat there bright and vibrant amidst the dry procedures, a beautiful reminder of the true meaning of her work. We often jump to judgment, labeling a stepmother as uncaring or a wealthy father, as simply too busy forgetting that anyone can become a casualty of invisible pressures and preconceived notions. Noah's ordeal was a powerful wake-up call. Sometimes what a child and even an adult truly needs isn't an inheritance or lavish gatherings, but simply the genuine presence of one another over a humble, ordinary Happy Meal. The preceding story is entirely fictional. The characters, settings, and events have been created solely to illustrate an educational and artistic message. Any resemblance to real people or actual events is purely coincidental.